feel all right now.
Hey, I feel all right now.
Do you feel like I do right now?
Do you feel like I do right now?
Motivated,
Motivated,
sky high, rock steady,
rock steady.
Oh yeah,
oh yeah,
I can do it.
I can do it.
You can do it.
You can do it.
Hey, yeah.
Hey, yeah.
Okay, folks, I can only one of those. You've got David's pick on the air right now, and on the line with us is our special guest today, and this is really sort of a mixed thing. It's the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame show as well as David's pick. We've sort of combined them, and we've got a very special guest. And for some of the veterans that are listening, I'm sure, without a doubt, you came out of surgery and you saw this lady, and she was the angel in your eyes and heart as you came out. She was a post-operative nurse in Vietnam. Welcome to America's Web Radio and our show today, Diane Carlson Evans. Good morning, Diane.
Good morning, David.
Okay, so I've sort of told part of your story. Let's get right into it, and tell us, why did you decide to go to Nam or join the Army, and were you already a nurse?
Well, I guess, David, the timing was right for me. I graduated from high school in 1964, and I started studying nursing in Minneapolis that year, and now it's 1965, and my brother is drafted. And my farm buddies, my 4-H buddies, I was growing up in Minnesota on a dairy farm, and these boys who were farmers weren't getting college deferments like my brothers because they wanted to go on and be farmers, which they eventually did. So now I'm studying nursing, and I know there's a war going on in Vietnam. I have a brother already in the military with the 101st Airborne. He volunteered. And I'm watching the 6 o'clock news every single night, and I'm seeing casualties. I'm seeing body bags. I'm seeing helicopters picking up the wounded. And those images just were so powerful. And as I was studying nursing, I decided I'm going to join the Army and I'm going to go to Vietnam. And I walked down 10 blocks to an Army Nurse Corps recruiter in Minneapolis and walked in and told her I was studying nursing and how could I go, what did I have to do to go to Vietnam? And of course she said, well, you sign on the dotted line and the rest is history.
And and literally the rest is history, huh? They don't seem to take too long to get you in, do they?
No, and I'm having a harder time hearing you, David.
Okay, is that a little bit? That's all right. Is that a little bit better?
Well,
right.
It's hard. I'll.
Okay, well, it should be about there. Okay.
Okay.
And okay, so you go to Vietnam. You've been watching the news and so forth. And was it what you expected when you got there?
Well, I don't think any of us know what to expect except, what prepares you for war, but war itself. What I expected was what I saw on the 6 o'clock news, but that's very different for a nurse. I didn't see any nurses. By the way, I kept looking on the 6 o'clock news for nurses, and I didn't see a single image. We saw the men, the combat troops, and the helicopter pilots, and but we weren't seeing any images of women or nurses, and so I didn't see the inside of a military hospital until I walked into one in August 1st of 1968. And the war, of course, was escalating, 68 and 69. We had mass casualties frequently, as you can imagine. The names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall, 1968 and 69, are very large. And so it was what we call on-the-job training. I had finished my nursing school, and I had finished basic training at Brooke Army Medical Center, where all the doctors, medics, and Army and nurses go for 6 weeks of training. But we weren't trained very well. We weren't prepared very well for the kinds of casualties and the numbers of casualties we were to face. And what surprised me every day in Vietnam was we weren't just caring for injuries from weaponry. In Vung Tau, the 36th Evacuation Hospital, which was off the South China Sea and closer to the Delta, and rice paddies, we had injuries from water buffalo who had gorged some of our patients, and
Wow.
terrible injuries from water buffaloes. We had snake bites that we weren't prepared for whatsoever, and sea snakes from those GIs going on R&R to Vung Tau, and they were allowed to be on the beaches. Well, sea snakes are poisonous. And we had leeches, which were horrible for the troops who were walking around in the ice paddies and the jungle rot of their feet, of course. But then we had those horrific landmines of every kind. And after I left Vung Tau and seeing the myriad also of tropical diseases of every kind you can imagine, including plague, and napalm and white phosphorus burns, and also, as we all know, helicopter crashes. We used to say they crash and burn. Well, that's what they do. And if those inside that chopper were, by the grace of God, not killed, they would come into our hospitals with terrible burns. So we faced everything you can possibly imagine that we weren't prepared for in nursing school. And we learned on the job, and we just followed the doctor's orders and got in there and did the work to do everything we could to save these guys' lives. And malaria and medical problems, of course, were also huge. Now, when I went up to Pleiku in the highlands in the jungle, it was cooler. That part was nice. It wasn't as hot as in the Delta. But now we're in the jungle, and we have all kinds of snake bites, and tigers are out there, and we had troops who were attacked by tigers, if you can imagine, and killed by tigers as well.
Wow.
And I was closer to the fighting when I went to Pleiku. I was now made head nurse in this post-operative surgical unit, and our soldiers, our guys, were coming to us largely from Cambodia. We supported the 4th Infantry Division, who were being hit very hard in the spring of 1969. Now I'm up there about February 69 until I left in August. And our guys, our troops, were coming in by helicopter sometimes 10, 20 minutes away. And because of the incredible field medics and the chopper pilots, those dust-off pilots who went into such terrible landing zones to try to bring the wounded out, where they were being shot at in terrible weather. It was so dangerous. They were such heroes to us nurses. They brought them to us, and we tried to save them, or we gave them to God. And we did everything we could to save their lives. And that meant we were working under duress because our hospital was also being rocketed and mortared. It was a very dangerous area. And with mass casualties coming in, we were short of resources, human and supplies, and we didn't have enough ventilators. And then the generators would quit because we were working with generators. And so, I don't know, David, to answer your question, there isn't anything that can prepare you for that.
No.
You learn as you go.
I guess, were you in a Quonset hut type situation or tents, or what were you in as far as the quote-unquote hospital?
What was the question, David?
Okay, were you in a Quonset hut or a tent, or what was the hospital type situation?
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of the lay of the land. When I arrived in Vietnam, I think there were about 23, or I've also read 27 hospitals in South Vietnam, United States hospitals. and there were evacuation hospitals, there were surgical hospitals, there were MUST units, medical units, self-containable transportable, which people think more of a MASH type unit. They didn't work very well because they're deflatable, and the shrapnel, rockets, mortars, shrapnel, those units would deflate. They quit using them and they were also extremely hot. You had to have air conditioning going constantly in those. And then there were Quonset huts, and the Quonset huts were at the 36th Evacuation Hospital in Vung Tau, and it's a cantonment-style hospital. Each unit, they're spread out, so if there is an attack, it doesn't take down the entire hospital. It takes out one ward or two wards. And then when I went up to Pleiku, they were not Quonset huts. They were wooden structures, wooden frame buildings, and we had screens for our windows. There was no glass, of course, because it was, we were being rocketed and mortared. And also the nurses' quarters at Pleiku, when I got there, they had gone from tents in 1968 and 69 to wooden frame structures as well. There were 5 nurses in each hooch. We called them hooches. So
was that CB work, or was that the Army Corps of Engineers work?
Probably the Army. I didn't hear the entire question, David, but I probably Army Corps of Engineers.
They were the ones that built them?
I would guess so. Yeah. So,
Okay,
but if there's an Army Corps of Engineer veteran listening, he would tell us.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. When I got to Pleiku, what I remember so vividly, David, was I was flying by chopper over the jungle, and then I saw the defoliation. And so I'm landing, there's Camp Inari at Pleiku, and then there's the 71st Evacuation Hospital, which is 400 beds. It's huge, 400 beds of individual buildings. So like one building would be the operating room suite. Another building would be the recovery, connected to the OR would be close by the recovery room suite or unit. And then one unit was purely malaria ward. And then my unit was post-operative, where we took care of patients before and after surgery. And there were so many beds in this hospital that it was rare that we even would see the other doctors and nurses in the other units, except perhaps at the mess hall. So there were people working in that hospital that years later I found out we were there at the same time, but we had never met each other.
Well, and yet you hear stories on the other side that you run into somebody from your hometown or something sometimes.
Yeah, and that was always special to run into somebody that you actually knew.
Yeah, it was one of those things that sometimes it's a big world and sometimes it's a very small world. But Vietnam offered it all. I'm curious too. Some of my buddies and friends that went in country and came back, there was also quite a bit of parasites that got in their systems. And what kind of lab facilities did you all have?
Well, those, again, at the evacuation hospitals, there was the building that was the lab and pathology, and then, of course, there was Graves registration. And in my unit, I drew all the blood work for the lab work. So the doctor would write the order, and I would draw blood. The lab tech would come, pick up the lab work, and what often would happen is we would have a wounded soldier come in who with horrific wounds, and we would load them with antibiotics, but their temperature would keep spiking, and then we would discover that he also had malaria. So we had to rule out malaria at the same time as we were, trying to medicate these troops with not just analgesics and pain medication, but also huge doses of antibiotics. And now we've got malaria going on as well. So these troops would come in just with these horrific injuries, and then they may have also been drinking the local rice wine and developed hepatitis.
Oh, wow.
So and the parasites were of course, everywhere, the parasitic infections. So these poor guys were dealing with so much all at once. And our job was at an evacuation hospital, our job was to stabilize the soldier and send him to the next safe place, the next best place. And if he got the $1 million wound, of course, that meant he was going home. And so the $1 million wound, we stabilized the patient. When he was stable enough to put him on the next air evac chain to get him back to the United States or to Guam or to Tokyo or to Hawaii or wherever the physician and they had decided where the next best place for recovery might be. So burn cases were always very touchy, very like when could we transfer a burn patient? And then they would often go directly to Brooke Army Medical Center, which had the world's largest burn unit at the time. So it was all about stabilizing, doing triage, making the assessment as to how long this patient would have to stay in our hospital to get him to the next hospital, because with mass casualties coming in, we had to open up our beds to receive the new guys coming through.
We're going to take a very, very quick break. And in fact, the way we're going to break this time is to tell everybody that if you're coming to Atlanta, or if you live in Atlanta and listening, there's so many people that aren't aware of the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. It's downtown in the Floyd Building, right across the street from the Capitol. And if you haven't been to it, you've got to go to it. It's incredible. Read about all the Georgians that saved our world in many ways, and that fought for you and fought for me, and in many cases gave the ultimate sacrifice. Not only do we have the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame, but we also have, and you mentioned it, and I want to come back to it, Diane, is that in Johns Creek we have the Healing Wall, which is the 50% replica of the Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C. This is the wall that traveled all over the United States and let people have closure in many cases, and it was just super, and it is super. So make plans, and also the Veterans Memorial in Peachtree Corners, and we have just a number of great places. So with that being said, we're talking to Diane Evans, and Diane, I want to thank you for your service to our country during Vietnam, and I'm sure that this goes for everyone, and the many people that the many vets that woke up and saw you taking care of them. And I would guess there's probably some out there that are listening right now that remember, they might not remember your name, but they'd remember your face and remember how glad they were to wake up and see you there taking care of them. So thank you. So we're still on the line with Diane, I hope. And
I'm still here.
Okay.
I'm still struggling with hearing you really well, but
Well, I can't. I'll blow up my system if I. Can you
Okay.
Can you turn your phone up some?
I've tried that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we can. I can take care of my end, but I can't take care of the other end.
We'll be good, I think.
Yeah, I think we will.
I'll just ask you to repeat the question if I'm not sure. Go ahead,
okay.
David.
No, I just was saying thank you for your service, and I'm sure there are a lot of veterans out there that would also want me to pass on the thanks, that they're the ones that woke up and saw that you were the nurse taking care of them after they came out of surgery or whatever the situation might be. And I'm sure they would appreciate me passing on their thanks and their gratitude. And, so many things changed. And I guess during Vietnam, we got the impression that everything was a MASH unit, and there was nothing but laughter and pranks and funny things happening, and that was far from the case. It was quite a serious place that you were, and quite a serious situation that all were going through at the time. And let me ask, I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but I know when I was an EMT, there was only one situation that I ever followed up on, and I felt so sorry for the kid that we had taken to the hospital that I just, my own curiosity just had to follow him. But did you ever have any follow up with any of your patients that came through and you worked with in post-op?
Well, yes. After I had founded the Vietnam Women's Memorial effort and with the dedication of the wall in 1982, I was living in Wisconsin, and I was out getting the mail, and my neighbor came and talked to me. He was about my age, and asked some questions, and he mentioned that there was this memorial going to be dedicated out in Washington, D.C., and I said, yes, and I'm going out there for that. And he said, well, was your husband there? That's kind of a typical question. And I said, no, he wasn't, but I was. So I want to go find a couple of names, and I want to see that memorial. And he said, oh, well, he said that he was there in Vietnam, and he was going out to the dedication as well. And I said, oh, well, when were you there? And he said, 1969 with the 4th Infantry Division. And I said, well, I was caring for the 4th Infantry Division up in Pleiku in spring of 1969. And he said, I was wounded. And then he looked at me and he said, he said, were you Lieutenant Carlson? You have red hair. And I do have red hair. And I said, yes, I was Lieutenant Carlson. And he was just incredulous. He said, you were my nurse. I remember you.
Wow.
And it was March of 1969, and he had been wounded, and he came into my unit. And that was the first patient. That was the first person that I had encountered that I had actually cared for in Vietnam. And it was really extraordinary. And he was also very incredulous and happy to finally meet his nurse. And like you said, I think, David, one of the things when the guys came into our hospital, they felt safe. Hospitals were not safe in Vietnam. Like I said, we were rocketed and mortared. And several months before I arrived at the 71st Evac in Pleiku, when the hospital had been attacked, several patients in their beds had been wounded again and were killed. Wow. Lying in a hospital bed, they were killed. And so there was a false sense of security. But by and large, if those chopper pilots could get the patients to us from the field within 1 hour, we had a 98% save rate. We saved 98% of these guys if they could get to us within the first hour, that golden hour.
The golden
then,
hour,
of course,
yeah.
if there was mass casualties, there was triage, and those who were the most severely wounded were not the ones that went to the operating first. The ones who were most salvageable and would take the least amount of time with the number of surgeons that we had and the OR staff. It was all based on resources and how many wounded could we save. And the soldiers who were expectants, those who were expected to die, were not left alone. There was someone who stayed with them, and I remember staying with someone one night and just stayed with him and held his hand until his hand went cold. But for us nurses, we didn't want anyone to die alone because we were all they had.
Oh, yeah. Oh, what a story. And, you and I talked earlier this week, and I've got to circle back to something you said, and I guess my heroes of heroes are the dust-off pilots, they went through hell and back to save lives, to get the guys out or women out. And they amazing chopper pilots, and I'm not sure that I've met one that feared anything. They certainly didn't fear death itself, or they wouldn't have done what they did, because they were talking about in the line of fire. They went into hot zones, LZs that were surrounded at times. And there were a number of the and they flew Hueys. And if you were a wounded soldier and you heard that thump, 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 very distinct Huey sound. If you heard that coming towards you, you knew that you were about to get out of there. And
the sound of those chopper blades was the sound of a benevolent God. It was like, talk about angels. Those guys were angels too. And I have a story about a helicopter pilot for you. I was taking care of. He was burned, like they usually were, and recovering from his burns. And he was going to be okay. We didn't have to send him back to the United States. He was going to recover and go back flying choppers, helicopters, dust-offs. But it was his birthday, the day I was taking care of him, and I was hanging in his IV, and I had looked at his chart, and I said, "Happy birthday." I said, "But according to your records, you're 20 today. Is that a mistake?" And he said, "No, ma'am, I'm 20 today." And I said, "Well, how can you be in Vietnam flying helicopters when you're 19? And he said, "Well, ma'am, I graduated from high school when I was 18. He said, I think he said he went to Fort Walters. And in 9 months, he was a helicopter pilot, and in Vietnam at the age of 19, flying dust-offs.
Oh.
I was absolutely incredulous. Like, how does that happen? Of course, us nurses, we were young, too. We were 21 by the time we got out of college. I was 21 when I arrived in Vietnam. And the average age of the nurses was between 21 and 25, so we were the young taking care of the young. But I think the reason that we were so brave and fearless, David, is because we were young, and we felt I couldn't see myself dead. Right? I was so young, or my sense of mortality just was until I got to Vietnam. The bullets didn't say no nurses. I knew that, and some nurses had already died by helicopter crashes. And then Sharon Lane was killed when I was in Vietnam. She was on duty at Chu Lai. And their hospital was rocketed, and she caught a piece of shrapnel, and she was dead in seconds. And so no place was safe. But these helicopter pilots, they would go out on these missions without any regard for their own safety, because our mission was to save lives. And of course, the Army Nurse Corps' motto was preserve the fighting strength. And these chopper pilots would go into extreme conditions to bring out the wounded. So I agree with you. They were our heroes. And of course, they brought them into us, and then they could leave them. And then it was our turn to do our work. And our work turned into often 14, 15, 16-hour days. If we were lucky, we got a day off. But it was all about our patients. It was never about ourselves. We had a job to do, and that was save lives.
The thing, too, that it was like you were talking about OJT. Well, we had some OJT engineering on Huey helicopters, because initially the dust-offs, the pilots were being killed from the bottom up, and they wound up putting a steel plate in the Huey, or on the bottom of the Huey, where if they were shot at, they could still take a rocket, but they couldn't at least be killed by ground fire shooting up and killing the pilot through his seat. So, they did modify them, and then they went from the Huey as a medevac to Huey as a fighting machine, and then they obviously developed the Cobra and everything else. But as a gunship, it was a powerful tool that we used. And but the Huey pilot that was the dust-off pilot, and I tell you somebody else, and I do this frequently on this show and other shows, is that when I was in, and I'm called a Vietnam veteran era, but there were so many that were going in and being patriotic objectors, and I just really had a hard feeling for them. But many of those that went to Fort Sam Houston and became medics, and they risked their life many times bringing people out. And the conscientious objectors, I changed my mind about with the service that they performed without weapons. All they had was a bag that had a Red Cross on it, and many of them died themselves taking care of the wounded. And
I can attest to that, David. I had several conscientious objectors as medics in my unit in Pleiku, and they were fantastic. Some of them had more education than I did. One of these he got drafted, but he was a conscientious objector, but he had a master's degree. And here he was, one of my medics on the unit, and he was phenomenal. Well, I can't say enough about our corpsmen and our medics and those field medics. And if they were lucky, they would let them out of the field after 6 months to come into our hospitals where they could feel a little safer. But and the helicopter crew, the door gunners, those guys were sitting targets, and they were there to protect, that chopper. And I'll never forget the door gunner that sat with me, and I thought, well, he's not very friendly. He never said a word to me. He didn't talk to me. He didn't look at me. And I sat there, of course, my first chopper ride from Long Binh. I had just arrived in Vietnam, and there's a helicopter that has arrived just for me. That makes you feel important, right? They're going to take me to my first assignment, to my first hospital assignment. And this door gunner doesn't say hello. He's just very unfriendly. So I'm on the chopper, and we land on the Red Cross, the landing pad at the hospital, and I get down out of the chopper, and he says to me, "Ma'am, keep your head down." And that's the only words he ever said to me. And then I realized he was doing his job. He wasn't there to be friendly and talk to me. He never took his eyes off the ground the entire time we were in that chopper. He never took his eyes off the ground. And with his, big weapon, his gun, his whatever it was called, out of that chopper. And I just, the life of a helicopter pilot and his crew wasn't very long. There are a lot of names on the wall who and of course now the language today, David, when I talk about my patients, they were all men, because there were some women in Vietnam who were wounded, but I never saw a wounded woman in Vietnam outside of Vietnamese, and we did take care of Vietnamese women and children in our hospitals. We took care of large numbers of them. But our wounded were the men, because we weren't sending women into combat situations like today, where women are losing their arms and their legs as well in large numbers compared to previous wars. But and of course, I never saw a female helicopter pilot in Vietnam because we didn't have any, and we only had 2 female physicians in Vietnam. So if you weren't a nurse, a female nurse. Now, there were male nurses in Vietnam as well. Maybe almost 1/3 of the nurses in Vietnam were male nurses. And so when we think nurse, we think female, but that's a thing of the past. Men and women are nurses today and have been for many years. So just wanted to clarify that.
This show and many shows remind me sometimes of Paul Harvey, and when he would do, and that's the rest of the story. But our shows are almost, this is the other side of the story, and I'm hearing things from you that I didn't know, and and I've never said I should know them, but at the same token, I knew some of the pilots, and some of the folks that had come back and so forth, and the general public has no idea of Vietnam, and I got tickled, or not tickled, I just thought to myself when you said that you went in and it was OJT, on the job training, but that's the way everything was. Even the infantrymen, particularly the first in, we were not jungle trained. We were open field trained, and all of a sudden here we are in a jungle. And then I did basic and AIT at Fort Ord, and it was all jungle training. Then here comes Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and we say, why do we have green APCs or green tanks when we're in the desert? And so they rushed all the tanks back and repainted them here in Georgia, as a matter of fact. But it's
war is, learn as they go. We were very, ill-equipped and unprepared in the early years of Vietnam. Very ill-equipped and unprepared. When the first nurse anesthetist, I know a friend of mine, when she got to Vietnam in 1965 and was assigned to what you would call a MASH type hospital, it was a medical unit, self-contained, one of those movable ones that you blow up, and of course you can't blow them up and last that, because the first time they're rocketed. So then there's sandbags packed to the hilt, sandbags everywhere to protect the sides, but you couldn't put sandbags on the top, so if something came from on the top, then that unit is gone. She said her anesthesia equipment that arrived to her hospital was from World War II.
I can believe
and she
it.
did not know how to use it. And of course they built their own, they put up their own tents, and it's muddy, or it's, depending on where you are in Vietnam, it's either mud and monsoons or it's 105 degrees. And then to get in the types of injuries, I want to talk about the landmines. You talk about a landmine. Well, there's
the IEDs today.
There's hundreds of different kinds of. Well, the NVA and the Viet Cong were very crafty with very little resources. They didn't have a lot of money like we did with our weaponry and our jets and our, think of the money that we poured in to our Department of Defense to finally have the right equipment for our troops. But they would, to demoralize the soldier and to decapacitate him, maybe not kill him, but to decapacitate him for months, was to lace punji sticks, which you just go out and get them, right? They're free. They're just growing. Punji sticks. They're sharp.
With
lace
poison
it with
on them.
human feces. And the troops would step on those, and, the combat boots were black leather boots. Well, finally they put, like you talked about, steel plates on the bottom of helicopters. Well, put steel plates on the bottom of their boots. So they designed jungle boots, which were lighter in weight and didn't create as much jungle rot as the black leather combat boots, which is what I wore for an entire year, the black leather, because I found them more comfortable. So the troops would step on these punji sticks and have an instant injury and instant bacterial infection, which would cause gangrene, and they would die. And we took care of them in our hospital, and many of them got sent back to the United States because if it's an orthopedic injury or if it gets into the bone, it's going to be a longer-term recovery. Well, then we had the Bouncing Betty landmines, and they came up with those to demoralize the troops because they came up to hit the troop waist high. It would blow off his genitals, and it was horrible. And then, of course, grenades and tripwires, and, the troops out there who are former troops who are listening to this could describe this a whole lot better than me. I saw the results of war. I didn't see how the injury happened. I know a little bit about what happened because they would tell us, but we saw the results of these things every day, and I can guarantee you every patient in my unit, and there were 65 patients in my first unit at Vung Tau, and I had 45 in my unit in Pleiku, every one of them had a different injury from a different cause. High velocity, of course, weapons, guns, so on. But then there were accidents, vehicle accidents, and of course the helicopter accidents, and sucking chest wounds. The chest wounds were horrible. We had to get they had to have tracheotomies, they had to be on ventilators. We did not have enough ventilators, and when the generator quit, we had to stand there and amboo them with an amboo bag to keep them breathing, because you can't breathe without a ventilator, and
Right.
but you could with an amboo bag, but that's a manual handheld where you're actually trying to put air, oxygen and air into that patient so they don't die. So
and
we
it
are
can
just
it can
surrounded.
get very tiring very quickly.
What's that?
It can get very tiring very quickly when you're doing that.
Well, we were exhausted at the end of the day.
As I recall, it would be Bagum, and that's when you would go for the manual respirator, basically.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'm sure a lot of your patients mentioned at one time or the other, or you knew, but many of the injuries that you saw were caused by stuff that we had left behind. Even from the some of the Poppin' Johnnies that they used were from our sea ration cans. We would just toss them to the side and say, what the heck? Let the Viet Cong clean them up. Well, they cleaned them up and turned them into weapons. It was like our laws that we our rockets that were called laws. If we just after we fired the rocket, they weren't reloaded, but the Viet Cong would take them and make martyrs out of them. And they were just, and we learned quickly that we would start policing the area so we weren't supplying the Vietnamese with weapons to kill us.
IV bottles. We didn't have bags back then. They were glass.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to start crushing them because they were being stolen. And the bottles were taken to their underground hospitals and for reuse. And so what you just said, David, is very true. They were very resourceful, and they would take our trash and they would reuse it. And they were very crafty and ingenious at that. And because they didn't have the finances that we did, they became very, like I talked about with these punji sticks, and that caused the crippling wounds, but it cost them nothing.
And the booby traps we see on TV every now and then, where the bungee sticks not only were in the ground, but they also would strap them to trees with a tripwire and spring up and get our guys. So, yeah, like you hit it right on the head. They were very crafty, and we had to learn a lot. And I can't imagine a cave as a hospital, and they had underground caves as hospitals. But you wonder, and they wanted to save their people just like we wanted to save our people. And
that's right. That's right, David. You're absolutely right. They were as committed to their husbands and fathers and brothers and as we were to our guys. But I want to say something here about my patients, because we hear a lot about the greatest generation, and they were great, and what they did for us and for the world, and I would never deny that, and I hold them in high esteem. But there's greatness in every generation, and there was greatness in mine, and that was in my patients. And in the Vietnam generation who served their country, we answered the call. Some of us volunteered, and we didn't have to go. Others were drafted and didn't want to go, but they did. And my patients, I know, were as brave as any other soldier in any other war. And I saw how they suffered. I saw how they died. I saw how they cared more about each other than themselves. It was always about the guy in the next bed. Oh, take care of him. His wound is worse than mine. I saw how they cared for each other. When they came in, the lieutenants and the sergeants would come in to see their guys who had been wounded from their platoon, and how much they cared for them. And those guys just wanted to get better and get back to their unit. And many of them did. We didn't send them home. They recovered, and we sent them back to the unit so they could get shot at again. And why do they have several Purple Hearts? Because they were wounded again and again and again. And then to come home to this country, and people, not all, but a lot of people in this country turned their backs on these soldiers or denigrated them or called them names.
Or spit on them going through the airport.
What's that?
Or spit on them going through the airport and yelling things at them going through the airports. And
it was the most discouraging, sad thing I've ever seen. To know how these young men who had given for their country in the same way as all previous wars, but then to be treated so terribly when arriving home. And it took years and years and years for them to even be able to admit they were Vietnam veterans.
Yep.
Because we were made to feel like we should be ashamed of it. And it took the dedication of the wall in 1982 for people to finally wake up and finally look at who these veterans really were and what they had done. And, thank yous came, but a little late, and so many veterans suffered for years, not just from their physical wounds, but from the emotional wounds of the betrayal of our nation when we came home.
Absolutely. You've said it beautifully, and and this is where we get the term PTSD. In other wars, it was shell-shocked or whatever it might be called in. But, and thankfully, and this is, I like Israel from the standpoint of everybody serves their country. And I get very upset with folks that in one shape, form, or fashion haven't served. This is all of us. It's all our country. It's not just the people that raised their hand and went to Nam. It's everybody. And I get very upset with the representative or senator that never served a day, and they're making rules of engagement, and they don't know what they're talking about. And it goes on. And I think everybody should serve in some way, and certainly never, ever treat returning soldiers the way Nam soldiers were treated. And it doesn't matter what branch you're in, how you served, it's just that you served your country. And another thing, Diane, that we interview a lot of folks, and I don't know of a veteran that I've interviewed that if the call came, no matter what age they are, if they could get up out of the chair, they would go back in.
Well, I have to say, David, that I've been asked, would I do Vietnam over again, knowing what I know now? And I said, in a heartbeat. I would do it all over again, even knowing what it was like. Because remember, every one of us who were 18, 17, 21, whatever age we were naive. We did not know what we were getting into. We did not know what we were going to face or how we'd have to measure up. And yet, for those of us who would say we would do it again, I can say that because I went there to save lives. And someone has to do it. Someone has to stand up. Like today, when you think of the tens of thousands of medical professionals we have in hospitals right now with facing risk, taking care of our COVID, virus patients who are very, very ill, and some are dying, and thousands are dying. But those medical professionals show up at work, and they know that they are at risk, not for being rocketed and mortared. I say, the only difference today is they're not getting shot at, but they're putting their life at risk to help others, and they show up. And I think that there is heroism. And we have that in America. And yet we have less than 1% of our population is serving in the armed forces today. And I worry about that because I think people assume that, the volunteers will go fight for us. Let them volunteer. When we had the draft, people were drafted from every part of society in the United States. I didn't believe there should be deferments. I don't think just because you're in college you should be deferred. I don't think that was right, because I think that took a lot of those young men who weren't in college, and that was their choice, it took them. Why should those in college have been deferred? I don't think that was right. I think that was a mistake. Let us all serve, and let us all step up and know what it's like to defend our country in some way. We don't all have to be combat soldiers. Some do, but there are so many ways to serve. So I agree with you, David. I think we'd be a better country if we, as individuals, knew that it was our responsibility as well to continue to defend our country, but also to make it a better country in some way.
That's why I'm so proud of my youngest son that's in the Air Force and is going to make it a career. And I always go into this little spiel, too. He's making it a career, and he's stationed in Germany right now. He'll soon be back in the States. He's put his 6 in and going for his 20, I think. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I love him dearly and appreciate his service for his country. With that being said, I'd like to point out the fact that if you're listening to the show and you've got a grandson, granddaughter, you are a young person listening to the show, and you haven't decided what you're going to do, please look into the military. It doesn't matter which branch, whether it's Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, whatever. Just look into it, because it can be a wonderful career. Like my young son, he and his wife have traveled all over the world. He wound up getting his master's degree while he's been in, and you know, it's a great life. It really is. Yes, you're separated sometimes from your family, but at the same token, the military offers everything from education to advanced training in an area. And once you get out of the military, if you decide to, or if you decide to make it a career, either way, you are trained and well-trained and wanted and needed in industry and in business and in whatever it happens to be. But you have gotten something that, like Diane points out, and I hate that statistic, but 99% of the population doesn't take the opportunity to get what the military will give you. I'll get off my soapbox. Would you agree with that, Diane?
Well, we know that there should be choices out there for our young people to serve in some way. My daughter served in AmeriCorps for 2 years because she said, "Mom, I don't think I want to go into the military, but I want to serve somehow." So she served in the AmeriCorps, and then of course that's domestic Peace Corps. Peace Corps takes you overseas. AmeriCorps takes you here in the United States. So there are many ways to serve, but for me, the military was a privilege. It was a privilege to serve my country. And I think if we look at it as a privilege to do our part, and it was a privilege to care for those young soldiers. It was not easy, but we need people to step up and do the important work. And so, and then on the last note here, David, if I may, when women step up to serve, as they have for centuries, we need to remember and honor them equally as we remember and honor our brother veterans. And that's why I worked so hard for 10 years to honor and remember the women of the Vietnam War by placing the Vietnam Women's Memorial Statue just 300 feet from the apex of the wall in Washington, D.C. And it took 10 years because there was opposition. David, believe it or not, people weren't supporting women, veterans, back then. They thought that we should just come home and get on with our lives and, you know, have babies and whatever. But women also served, and many of them who stayed in the military and went on and became, you know, top sergeants. They became leaders in the enlisted ranks. They became, for the first time, generals. When I was in the Vietnam, we couldn't have a female general. 1970, first woman became a general. So we've made progress, and each generation of women opens doors for the next generation. Like today, women are in, every role basically in our armed forces. But we need to honor and remember them in our memorials as we do the men. And so the Vietnam Women's Memorial, which is a monument of 3 women, and one of them is tending to a wounded soldier, is a monument to remember their contribution and the value of their service. And that is, I think, critical to our nation and to men and women knowing that if they're going to go off and put themselves in harm's way and in peril, that they are giving of themselves and sacrificing maybe their lives, that their nation is behind them and supporting them and welcoming them home, and then taking the steps outside of just symbolic gestures, but real gestures to take care of them financially, and with our Veterans Administration, keep those VA hospitals strong, keep them funded, and protect and take care of our veterans like they took care of us.
Absolutely. No question about it. And thank you for spending the time and the effort to get that placed at the Vietnam Wall. I think that's wonderful. And maybe you can do the same for the Johns Creek version of it's not a version, it is the wall, but it's a 50% size of it that travel all over the United States. And it's on display, and I think it would be great if the same monument or statue were put in there in Johns Creek. I'll talk to them about it. Because you're right. Women have always played it, and and I also bring up the fact that women play, whether they go into the service or do whatever. If their husband is serving, the woman is serving as well. The wife is serving just like the husband. Maybe not under fire there, but under fire stateside, taking care of the kids, taking care of this, taking care of that. And they sacrifice just like the men do. And in many cases, maybe
more. You're right, David. And now we have husbands at home with the kids while their wives are overseas.
Yes, ma'am.
So today it's working both ways, that the spouse might be the husband, and he's holding up the whole home front, and he's not in the military, but his wife is in the military, and she's overseas. So now we're seeing a whole different landscape of military service among men and women, with so many, what is it, I think now it's 15% of our military are women. When I was in the military, women were less than 1% of the entire military force, so we've come a long way. And we see that women have stepped up and proven themselves and are capable and able, and I think it just makes us a stronger nation, a stronger society when we allow women to be in the ranks when they're capable and meet the same criteria.
Diane, I hate to interrupt you, but
what is required to get the job done.
Yeah, I hate to interrupt you, but I have to thank you and tell you we're out of time, and thank you for your service. And I always ask, will you come back and be on again?
Oh, of course. Thank you so much for having me, David.
Well, this has been great, and you're listening to America's Web Radio, and want to thank Diane Carlson Evans for sharing her stories and talking about her service to our country. Thank you again, Diane, and we'll be back with more after this.
You're listening to America's...
Okay, Diane, what do you think? Diane.
The Docs for Patient Care